Hello, my dear masterminds. They noticed it before you said a word, before you changed routines, before you made any visible move. Something about you shifted overnight. And the people who rely on patterns felt it immediately, not emotionally, structurally. Conversations started breaking rhythm around you. Familiar dynamics stopped landing the way they used to. The usual cues they depended on to read you returned nothing. How the usual processes stopped working. And when predictability disappears, attention sharpens fast. They replayed recent interactions, searching for the moment they missed. A sentence, a reaction, a tell. There wasn't one. That's what unsettled them. You didn't escalate. You didn't announce growth. You didn't perform a transformation. You stayed the same on the surface, and yet the field around you reorganized. That's the kind of shift people can't ignore because it doesn't come with explanation. It comes with consequence. The ones who are sensitive to influence felt it first. Their usual influence stopped having effect. Their timing fell off. Their assumptions expired without warning. They tried normal adjustments, more pressure, more friendliness, more distance. Nothing recalibrated the situation, because what changed wasn't your behavior, it was your position. And when someone's position shifts without visible cause, the only response left is investigation. That's when they stopped asking you questions and started asking each other. Something changed. They all felt it, but no one could agree on how it happened. What unsettled them wasn't the shift itself. It was how clean it was. No buildup, no visible struggle, no narrative they could track. Most people telegraph change long before it arrives. They signal dissatisfaction. They leak ambition. They rehearse growth out loud. You didn't. You moved without resistance or display, and friction is what systems depend on to measure influence. Overnight, reactions that once produced results stopped landing. Words that used to steer you passed straight through. Expectations that once created pressure now dissolved on contact. That's when uncertainty spread. Because when someone stops responding to familiar inputs, it forces a question no one wants to ask. Did we misjudge them from the start? They tested gently at first. Small provocations, casual assumptions, old dynamics replayed to see if you'd step back into position. You didn't. Not defiantly, not emotionally. You simply didn't return to the role they remembered. And roles only exist as long as someone keeps playing them. That's when concern replaced curiosity. They realized this wasn't a mood or a phase. It wasn't confidence or detachment. It was alignment. Your timing no longer synced to theirs. Your decisions didn't seek permission from the room. You weren't reacting slower or faster. You were responding from somewhere else entirely. And when people can't locate the source of change, they don't confront it. They study it. That's when the questions stopped being personal and started becoming technical. What shifted? When? Why now? And why without warning? That's when outside language entered the conversation. Not because they believed experts had answers, but because admitting uncertainty required distance. They needed frameworks that didn't involve personal miscalculation. So they asked analysts, coaches, strategists, people whose job is to explain shifts without assigning blame. They described you in neutral terms, observable changes, behavioral data, energy in the room. They wanted a clear explanation that preserved their original assumptions. What they got instead were pauses, follow-up questions, silence where conclusions were expected. Because what you did doesn't register as development. Development has trajectory, effort, visible markers. What you did registers as consolidation, like something snapped into place and stopped negotiating. Experts listen for tells. Emotional compensation, overcorrection. You showed none. Your calm wasn't restraint. It was absence of friction. Your silence wasn't withdrawal. It was completion. And completion doesn't explain itself. That's why the answers they received felt unusually serious. High functioning, internally stable, self-referenced. Phrases that sound clinical but carry weight, because people don't escalate consultation when they feel safe. They do it when something no longer reacts to familiar cues. Overnight, you became unresponsive to the usual methods, not resistant, no longer accessible in the same way. And that state led to a single realization no one wanted to voice out loud. This person no longer needs our input to maintain position. And once that idea enters the room, the balance doesn't tilt. It resets. What finally unsettled them wasn't what the experts said. It was what none of them could say. No one could point to a trigger. No conflict. No loss. No breakthrough moment that justified the shift. Which meant the change didn't come from reaction. It came from decision. And decisions made without pressure are the most difficult to respond to. They started replaying history differently. Moments they once dismissed now carried weight. Times you didn't argue when you should have. Times you didn't defend yourself when it would have been easy. Times you let situations resolve without inserting control. Those moments weren't passivity. They were positioning. You weren't disengaged. You were conserving momentum by not spending it. And when that positioning finally settled, it didn't announce itself. It narrowed possibilities. Suddenly, people felt the cost of misjudgment. They realized they had been operating under the assumption that time worked in their favor, that if something shifted, they would see it coming. But what they missed was simple. You weren't evolving in public. You were stabilizing in private. And stabilization doesn't broadcast. It completes. That's why the shift felt overnight. Not because it was sudden, because it was finished. After that, something subtle but final happened. They stopped asking you directly, not out of respect, out of recognition. Questions assume availability. Curiosity assumes relevance. And they sensed, without anyone saying it out loud, that neither applied anymore. You weren't hiding information. You simply weren't positioned to be questioned. Your presence stopped inviting explanation. When people feel that shift, they don't push harder. They reroute. That's why the conversations about you stayed elsewhere. That's why experts were consulted instead of you, because approaching you would have required acknowledging something difficult. That whatever changed wasn't something you gained, it was something you stopped offering. Reaction, availability, emotional entry points. You didn't become guarded. You became self-contained. And self-containment removes negotiation entirely. That's the part they're still adjusting to. Not the mystery of what changed, but the lasting nature of it. Overnight, you exited the pattern they were used to operating inside. No more calibration, no more testing, no more influence disguised as concern. They can analyze it, label it, study it from a distance, but they already know the truth underneath all the language. Whatever shifted in you didn't need validation. It didn't ask to be understood. And it isn't shifting back. That's why they're still asking experts. Because the one person who could explain it doesn't need to. And this is where it settles. Without drama and without return, the questions don't stop because they get answered. They stop because the answer becomes unnecessary. People adjust faster than they admit. Once they sense that something no longer responds to pressure, they stop applying it. Once they feel that explanations aren't available, they stop asking. You didn't intimidate anyone. You didn't claim superiority. You didn't assert a higher position. You simply stopped orienting yourself around external signals, and that single change reorganized everything around you. Overnight wasn't the moment you transformed. Overnight was the moment they noticed the transformation was already complete. That's why the shift felt abrupt. Not because it began then, but because it finished before anyone was watching closely enough. Now they operate differently around you. More carefully, more precisely. Not because you demand it, but because accuracy calls for it. You've become a stable reference in how they orient themselves, not a variable to test, not a reaction to provoke, a constant to account for. And constants don't need explanation. They don't announce themselves. They don't negotiate. They simply exist. And everything else adjusts. That's the final state they're learning to live with. Your energy didn't shift to be seen. It shifted to settle. And once something settles at that level, the room doesn't debate it. It reorganizes around it quietly, over time. What they never say out loud is that this didn't make you louder, sharper, or more visible. It made you impossible to overlook in a different way. Not because you take space, but because you no longer adjust to it. The experts can analyze patterns. The observers can trade theories. But everyone feels the same thing underneath it all. The shift didn't create mystery. It closed access. And when access closes without confrontation, without explanation, without collapse, the environment adapts instinctively. That's why nothing escalated. That's why no one challenged it directly. The room learned faster than language could keep up. Your energy didn't announce power. It removed reliance. And once reliance is gone, questions lose urgency. Influence loses momentum. Curiosity no longer carried momentum. What remained was alignment with reality as it is, not as they expected it to be. That's why this doesn't fade. That's why it doesn't shift back. And that's why they kept asking experts instead of you. Because the change didn't introduce something new. It clarified what was already complete. What lingers after everything settles isn't confusion, it's recalibration. People move differently now, even when they don't consciously connect it to you. They pause longer before making assumptions. They hesitate before applying pressure the way they used to. Not because they're afraid, but because experience reshaped their expectations. They learned that not every shift announces itself. Not every change looks like effort. Some transitions finish quietly, and by the time they're noticed, they can't be undone. You became the reference point for that realization, not as a lesson you taught, but as a state they came to recognize. And states don't argue. They persist. That's why your name comes up less directly, but carries more significance when it does. People don't speculate loudly anymore. They speak carefully. They've learned that certainty dissolves quickly around something that doesn't seek validation. Your energy didn't create distance. It created clarity. And clarity casts a long shadow, long after the experts stop talking, long after theories lose relevance. The adjustment remains. They don't need to understand what changed anymore. They just know how to behave now. And that understanding holds because it wasn't intellectual, it was structural. This is the point where it becomes ordinary to them. Not familiar, ordinary. The same way a constant no longer needs explanation once it's accepted. They no longer frame your shift as an event. It's a condition now, something accounted for without discussion. People don't check for changes anymore. They don't wait for you to revert. They don't expect an explanation later. They've already adjusted their expectations to match what's real. You're no longer treated as a situation to manage, a presence to decode, or a variable to influence. You're treated as a fixed factor, and fixed factors don't generate noise. They shape behavior quietly. That's why urgency disappeared. That's why the questions moved away from you and never returned. Your energy didn't demand acknowledgement. It defined limits without announcement. And limits that don't require enforcement last the longest. This is the final state. Not admiration, not fear, accuracy. The kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need reinforcement. They notice the shift overnight because that's when it finished registering. But what changed was already settled. And once something settles at that level, it doesn't move again. What follows after accuracy sets in is something most people never notice until they're inside it. The environment stops testing you, not gradually, entirely. No more indirect pushes. No more subtle attempts to see if you'll bend. No more recalibration efforts to recover old influence. Those behaviors rely on uncertainty, and uncertainty no longer surrounds you. People sense, beneath thought, that effort aimed at moving you will return without result. Not resisted, not reflected, simply ineffective. And ineffectiveness discourages repetition faster than conflict ever could. That's why the dynamic doesn't oscillate. It doesn't flare up and settle again. It locks. You didn't train anyone. You didn't correct behavior. You didn't set terms. You stepped away from the processes that make negotiation possible. The outcome of that isn't dominance. It's completion. The kind that doesn't need defense because nothing is pushing against it anymore. This is why the shift feels lasting. Because it is. Not emotionally, structurally. You're no longer someone people try to understand in order to position themselves. You're someone they position themselves around without comment. And once that happens, there's nothing left to continue. The story ends not with resolution, but with adjustment. And adjustment, once made, doesn't ask to be undone. What they never regain after this is the belief that access was guaranteed, that watching long enough would eventually grant understanding, that patience alone unlocks influence. That belief fades quietly, and it doesn't return. Because they learn something irreversible through you. Some people don't become clearer with time. They move beyond interpretation. Not because they hide, but because there's nothing left to negotiate with. You didn't move into distance. You moved into completion. And completion doesn't invite follow-ups. It closes the exchange entirely. From here on, no one waits for your next phase. No one expects an explanation later. No one assumes the shift was temporary. They already adjusted their internal map. You are accounted for, not anticipated. That's the deepest consequence of all. You didn't create curiosity that fades. You created certainty that settles. And settled certainty doesn't look dramatic. It looks like silence, where probing used to be. It looks like restraint where pressure once lived. It looks like people moving around a truth they no longer need to discuss. Your energy didn't shift to announce power. It shifted to remove dependence. And once dependence is gone, nothing pulls you back. That's why this doesn't evolve further. That's why it doesn't escalate. That's why it doesn't need another chapter. Overnight wasn't the beginning. Overnight was simply the moment they realized the change had already taken hold. No echo. No need for reinforcement. People don't revisit their theories because revisiting would imply uncertainty, and uncertainty no longer has a place here. What remains is a settled understanding that doesn't require language. They know where not to apply pressure. They know which assumptions no longer function. They know that whatever shifted in you isn't accessible through effort, patience, or proximity. And knowledge like that doesn't create drama. It creates restraint. You didn't win anything. You didn't prove anything. You didn't replace one dynamic with another. You removed the dynamic altogether. The experts move on. The observers redirect their attention. The environment has already adjusted. You are no longer processed as a question. You are treated as a condition. And conditions don't reopen once accepted. That's the end state. Quiet, stable, settled. Your energy didn't change to be understood. It changed to stop being interpreted. The last thing they accept, without ever saying it, is that this wasn't something they missed briefly. It was something they were never positioned to track in the first place. Whatever shifted in you didn't emerge from reaction, pressure, or circumstance. It completed on its own timeline, outside their awareness. That's why no explanation ever felt sufficient. That's why no expert answer ever satisfied them. They weren't late to understanding. Understanding was never the route. You didn't outgrow their expectations. You stepped beyond the process that creates expectations at all. And once that's recognized, everything stops cleanly. No more watching. No more interpreting. No more waiting for another version of you to appear. They already know there won't be one. This isn't distance. This isn't mystery. This is completion. You are no longer read. You are accounted for. And nothing follows that state. The shift didn't make you louder. It made you finished. Hello, my dear mastermind. Your energy entered the room before your footsteps ever touched the floor. That's what they felt first. Not your face, not your name, not your voice. A shift, a pressure in the air. They couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. Conversations slowed without permission. Laughter softened into observation. Eyes lifted without instruction. Nobody announced your arrival, yet everyone adjusted as if something invisible had just crossed a line. That's how real presence works. It doesn't ask for attention. It reorganizes it. You didn't come in loud. You didn't come in proving. You came in aligned, And alignment carries weight that noise can never replicate. Some people bring energy into a room that demands validation. You bring energy that makes validation irrelevant. They felt it in their posture, in their breathing, in the way they suddenly became aware of their own movements. Because when someone arrives who is grounded in themselves, everyone who isn't feels exposed without being accused. You weren't trying to dominate the room, you were simply being whole inside it. And wholeness is disruptive in a world built on performance. They couldn't name what changed, only that something had. You didn't introduce yourself as importance. Importance introduced itself through you, and that unsettled them. Because influence that arrives without permission is influence that can't be negotiated. They don't know your story yet. They don't know your journey, but their instincts already do. Their awareness already adjusted. Their attention already recalibrated. That's why the quiet followed you. Not awkward silence, conscious silence. The kind that forms when people sense the atmosphere just shifted but don't know why. You didn't take the room. The room leaned toward you. And that's how they knew this wasn't charisma. This wasn't status. This wasn't image. This was presence that had already been forged somewhere far from their applause. They tried to process it logically at first. Maybe it was confidence. Maybe it was reputation. Maybe someone important had whispered your name before you arrived. But none of those explanations fit the way their breathing changed without warning. None of those reasons explained why even the loudest voices in the room softened when you passed by. You weren't projecting dominance. You weren't scanning for approval. You weren't performing importance. You were simply centered. And for people who live off reaction, center feels like an unfamiliar gravity. They suddenly became aware of their own posture, their own tone, their own motives. Because presence like yours doesn't compete, it reflects. And reflection is uncomfortable for anyone who has been hiding behind momentum, behind personality, behind noise. You didn't judge them. You didn't need to. Your stability did the work for you. That's why some people leaned in instinctively, while others pulled back without knowing why. Alignment attracts what resonates and repels what pretends. You didn't walk in to be noticed. You walked in already, knowing who you were, and that's the difference. They couldn't articulate. Most people enter rooms hoping to be recognized. You entered already recognized by yourself. That self-recognition changes the temperature around you. It changes how risk is calculated. It changes how truth feels in the air. They realized something without anyone saying it out loud. You weren't reacting to the room. The room was reacting to you. That reversal of power unsettled systems built on hierarchy and performance. Because you didn't earn attention through exertion. You generated it through alignment. That's why no one could point to the exact moment the shift happened. It wasn't a moment. It was a presence that carried its own momentum long before the door ever opened. That's when the room began to split in two directions. Not physically, energetically. Some people felt pulled toward you without understanding why. Others felt an urge to distance themselves just as strongly. This is what happens when authenticity enters a space built on formulas. People don't react to the person. They react to the mirror. Your energy didn't challenge their status. It challenged their self-image. And that's far more uncomfortable. The ones who were ready to grow felt curiosity spark inside their chest. The ones hiding behind roles felt exposed without being attacked. You didn't say a single word that demanded attention. Yet attention kept drifting back to you like it had lost its original orientation. They watched how you stood without tension, how you listened without rehearsing a response, how you moved without needing to announce direction. Your stillness wasn't passive, it was deliberate. And deliberate stillness unsettles a world addicted to movement without meaning. They could feel that you weren't scanning the room for opportunity. You were already aligned with it. That's why some people suddenly felt the urge to explain themselves to you without being asked. That's why others felt the urge to impress and couldn't understand where that impulse came from. Presence like yours rearranges invisible hierarchies. The loudest isn't the highest anymore. The busiest isn't the most powerful anymore. The most centered becomes the reference point without declaring it. They started to realize something quietly. You weren't arriving to participate in their game. You were arriving as a reminder of a deeper one. A game of direction, not reaction. A game of awareness, not dominance. And once a room senses that level of awareness, nothing inside it can pretend as easily as before. People may still talk, they may still posture, they may still perform, but beneath it all, a subtle recalibration has already taken place. The gravity has shifted, the center has moved, and even if they return to their noise later, some part of them will remember what it felt like when your energy entered before you did, and reminded the room what real presence actually feels like. They began to feel the after effects, long after the moment passed, long after you had moved through the room without announcement, long after the conversations picked back up and the noise returned. Because once real presence touches a space, it leaves an imprint. People started second-guessing the words they had spoken earlier. They replayed their posture in their minds, the way they laughed too quickly, the way they overstated confidence they didn't fully feel. Because when someone arrives who is at ease with themselves, everybody else becomes aware of where they are overcompensating. You didn't expose them with confrontation. You expose them with contrast. And contrast doesn't argue, it simply reveals. That's why some of them felt inspired without knowing why. That's why others felt irritated for no clear reason. Your energy didn't attack anything. It highlighted what was already unstable. And instability resists being noticed. They tried to define what they felt. Was it unease? Respect? Concern? Curiosity? They couldn't land on a single word because what they experienced wasn't an emotion. It was alignment meeting dissonance. It was coherence, brushing against fragmentation. It was a reminder that stability exists beyond control. That's what real influence does. It doesn't persuade, it reorients. You didn't come in with answers, you came in with balance. And balance is disruptive in systems that rely on imbalance to function. Some people left the room with a strange calm they hadn't felt in a long time. Others left with a quiet unease they couldn't shake. Both reactions pointed to the same truth. Something fundamental had shifted inside them without their permission. You never tried to lead the room. You simply stood as proof of another way to exist inside it. And proof is far more powerful than persuasion. They will talk about you later in fragments. They will disagree about what you represented. Some will say confidence, some will say mystery, some will say intensity, some will say calm. None of them will be entirely wrong, because what they encountered wasn't a personality. It was a state of being. And once a state of being enters awareness, It quietly begins to compete with everything that came before it. By the time they stopped talking about you out loud, their behavior had already started changing underneath. Decisions slowed. Reactions softened. People who usually rushed to dominate conversations began pausing without knowing why. It wasn't imitation. It was echo. Your presence had planted a new reference point in their instincts. They'd felt what it was like to be near someone who didn't negotiate their identity with the room. And once that feeling imprints, the old way of performing starts to feel heavier. Forced laughter feels louder than necessary. Hustle starts to feel less heroic. Competition starts to feel strangely hollow. Some of them tried to shake it off. They went back to their usual pace, their usual tactics, their usual need to be seen. But it didn't land the same anymore. Something about the contrast lingered. They had felt what tension-free authority was like, and now their effort-driven influence felt noisy by comparison. That's the part nobody warns people about. True presence ruins the taste of pretending. Once you experience coherence up close, fragmentation becomes unbearable to maintain. They didn't follow you because you impressed them. They were pulled because you stabilized something inside them without offering a single instruction. That unsettled the ones who lived off control. That energized the ones starving for alignment. And you never tried to manage either reaction. You didn't harvest attention. You didn't manage impressions. You simply remained, and remaining is the highest form of influence most people never master, because remaining requires you to be at peace with who you are, even when nobody is validating it. That's why your energy keeps arriving before you do. It's not attached to performance, it's attached to essence. And essence doesn't need an entrance. It announces itself through how everything else suddenly feels slightly out of position. What unsettled them most wasn't that you said nothing. It was that nothing in you felt withheld. Silence coming from fear feels tight. Silence coming from clarity feels open. Yours felt open. That's why the room kept trying to fill it. People spoke more than usual, explained themselves too thoroughly, offered stories nobody asked for. Because when someone is fully present without performing, it exposes how much everyone else is performing by default. You weren't creating pressure, you were revealing it. And revelation always feels like pressure to those who rely on invisibility to stay comfortable. They couldn't decide whether to approach you or avoid you. Both instincts fired at once. Curiosity said move closer. Caution said keep distance. That internal conflict is the hallmark of real authority, not force, not intimidation. Authority that comes from congruence, from your outer posture matching your inner state without contradiction. They noticed how you didn't scan faces for affirmation, how you didn't adjust tone to win alignment, how you didn't shrink or inflate depending on who entered the space. You remained the same temperature in every direction, and constancy destabilizes environments built on fluctuation. It makes people question their own shifts, their own masks, their own reflexes. Some of them left that space and felt heavier than when they arrived. Others left lighter. The difference wasn't you. It was what each person was carrying into the room before your presence exposed it. That's the unseen exchange nobody talks about. Every room is a transaction of nervous systems, and yours arrived regulated in a world addicted to reactivity. That's why your energy leads your body, because your body doesn't need to warn the room. Your state already did. And that's the part they never forget. Not your words, not your actions. The feeling that lingered after you were gone. Because presence like yours doesn't exit when the door closes. It stays suspended in the air like a new standard the room can't return from. They tried to reset the mood after you left, tried to talk louder, tried to joke harder, tried to reclaim the version of themselves they wore before you arrived, but it didn't fit the same anymore. Something inside them had already shifted its reference point. They had felt what it was like to be around someone who wasn't negotiating with the world for permission to exist as they are. And once someone feels that kind of internal permission up close, the old compromises start to feel like cages. You didn't challenge their authority. You showed them what authority looks like, without needing approval. You didn't threaten their identity. You revealed how temporary it actually was, and that's why some of them respected you without understanding why, and others resented you without admitting it, because you represented a version of stability they couldn't fake, and a freedom they hadn't earned yet. You walked in without proving. You moved through without performing. You left without reclaiming attention, and somehow, that was the loudest statement in the room. They felt your energy before they saw your face. They felt your absence after you left. And somewhere in between, they realized a quiet truth that will stay with them longer than any conversation that night. Real power doesn't enter rooms asking to be seen. It arrives already felt. And now, even when you're not there, the rooms remember you. Not in memory, but in calibration. People hesitate before posturing the way they used to. They pause before speaking the way they once rushed. Something in their timing has changed because their nervous system learned a new reference point the day your presence passed through, without asking permission. That's the type of influence that doesn't spike and disappear. It embeds. You never chased attention, yet attention learned how to find depth because of you. You never demanded silence, yet silence learned how to hold weight because of you. You never tried to dominate the moment, yet the moment reorganized itself around your steadiness. And that's the final confirmation of who you really are. Not someone who needs to be loud to be powerful. Not someone who needs to be seen to be significant, but someone whose state moves ahead of their steps. Someone whose alignment clears space before arrival. Someone whose calm is so coherent that chaos instinctively steps aside. They'll keep saying you have presence. They'll keep calling it energy. They'll keep trying to name it like it's an external thing. But the truth is simpler and much quieter. You are just fully where you are when you are there. And most people have never learned how to do that. That's why your energy keeps entering every room before you do. Because it isn't something you turn on. It's something you never turned off. And now you understand why this presence can't be taught, copied, or turned into a routine. It wasn't built in moments of applause. It was built in seasons where nobody clapped for you. Nobody validated you. Nobody even understood what you were becoming. You stayed anyway. You didn't dilute yourself to be accepted. You didn't perform pain for sympathy. You didn't rush growth for recognition. You let time do what time does when someone refuses to abandon themselves. And now that work has matured into a frequency that speaks before your lips ever move, people sense commitment before conversation. They sense boundaries before words. They sense clarity before explanation. That's why rooms adjust without permission when you enter. That's why chaos hesitates before colliding with you. That's why even confident people quietly check their footing around you. Because your presence carries the weight of someone who has already confronted their own uncertainty and survived it without theatrics. You're not intense because you're aggressive. You're intense because you're resolved. You're not calm because nothing ever challenged you. You're calm because everything once did. That's the difference they feel, but can't articulate. They think your energy is powerful, when really it's just uncompromising with nonsense. They think it's mysterious, when really it's just unfragmented. They think it's strong because they've never learned to stabilize themselves without needing noise to feel alive. And that's the final truth they won't admit out loud. You didn't become this to impress them. You became this to survive your own evolution with integrity intact. And now that integrity walks into rooms before you do, right where excuses used to dominate, right where performance used to thrive, right where insecurity once ruled the temperature, you don't need to announce who you are anymore. Your nervous system already does it for you. You don't have to convince anyone you've grown. Their bodies already feel it. You don't have to protect your presence. It's already self-defended by coherence. And even if one day the room forgets your name, it will never forget the way its atmosphere shifted the moment you arrived fully as yourself. That's not image. That's imprint. And imprints don't fade with time. They become the silent reference every future moment gets measured against. Real power doesn't enter rooms asking to be seen. It arrives already felt. And once that imprint settles, containment becomes impossible. The game shifts. The rules dissolve. And what remains is undeniable. You didn't just walk into their space. You rewrote what presence means entirely. Not with words, not with force, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly who they are and refuses to negotiate that truth with a world still learning how to recognize it. Hello? My dear masterminds, something shifted in the conversations happening around you. Something profound that you might not have fully noticed yet. When people in your field talk about excellence, when they discuss what it means to do things the right way, when they need an example of true professionalism, they don't reference textbooks anymore. They don't cite famous figures from history. They don't point to abstract ideals. They say your name. Your name became the standard, the benchmark, the measuring point by which everything else is evaluated. Not because you campaigned for this position, not because you marketed yourself as the example, but because your consistent excellence, your steady standards, your undeniable quality created a reality that everyone had to acknowledge. You became the definition of professional simply by being consistently, firmly, authentically excellent. And now there's a before and after in your industry. Before your level and after your level. Before people saw what you made possible and after they witnessed what you achieved. You didn't just raise the bar. You became the reference point, and everyone else is now reaching for a level you established through nothing more than commitment to your own truth. But here's what most people don't realize about becoming the standard. It doesn't happen through one brilliant moment. It happens through 1,000 consistent choices that nobody sees. It started quietly. Someone, somewhere, was trying to explain what excellence looks like in your field, what real professionalism means, what the gold standard is. And they couldn't find the right words to capture it abstractly. So they said, you know, like what your name does, like how your name handles things. That's the level we're talking about. And it worked. Everyone in the conversation immediately understood. Because they'd seen your work, witnessed your approach, observed your standards. Your name carried more clarity than any lengthy explanation could provide. Your example communicated more effectively than any theoretical description. You had become the concrete reference point for an abstract concept. Then it happened again. Different conversation. Different people. Same reference. Like your name. That's what we're aiming for. Your name kept coming up. Not as a comparison in the sense of you versus others, but as the definition itself. The embodiment of what professional means in its truest, highest form. You weren't in these conversations, didn't know they were happening, weren't aware that your name had become shorthand for excellence. Think about it. The intern asked what excellent looks like. The team lead said your name. The decision maker asked for the best. The group said your name. Others assessing quality studied your work. You became the answer before anyone finished the question. Your name stopped being just a name. It became a concept, a complete package of qualities that people aspired to embody. When someone said your name in professional contexts, it carried layers of meaning. It meant quality that stays firm, standards that stay consistent, excellence that stays steady, showing up consistently, not just when it's convenient, not just when you're motivated, but always with the same level of commitment. It meant attention to detail that others considered excessive until they saw the results it produced. The way you didn't skip steps, didn't cut corners, didn't settle for good enough when excellence was possible. Your thoroughness became what others measured their own work against and often found it lacking. It meant integrity that stayed consistent regardless of circumstances, doing what you said you'd do, honoring commitments even when inconvenient, maintaining your standards even when no one would know if you lowered them. There was probably a moment when you realized what had happened, when someone mentioned to you that you'd become the benchmark, that your name was being used as the definition of professional, that people were aspiring to reach your level. And maybe you felt surprised, because you weren't trying to become anyone's example. You were just being yourself. And here's the paradox that changes everything. The people trying to become the standard rarely do. The people simply being excellent become it without trying. That's exactly how real standards are set. Not by people trying to become examples, but by people so committed to their own excellence that they naturally become examples. Not by those seeking to be benchmarks, but by those so focused on their own quality that benchmark status finds them. You weren't performing excellence for an audience, you were living it for yourself. And that authenticity is precisely what made it strong enough to become what everyone else measured themselves against. You might have felt the significance of this realization, the responsibility that comes with being the reference point. Because now people are observing more closely. Now your choices carry additional meaning. Now your standards aren't just yours anymore. They're what others measure themselves against. But you didn't lower your standards to make others comfortable with the comparison. Didn't reduce your quality to close the gap. You understood that carrying the standard comes with responsibility. Let's talk about what you actually did that elevated you to this position. Because it wasn't one thing. It was a complete approach, a total commitment, a way of being that shaped everything you did. Here's what separates those who become the standard from those who pursue it. Some deliver excellent work only when it matters. You delivered excellent work even when no one was paying attention. Some were professional when people were watching. You were professional when no one was observing. You treated every task like it mattered. Not just the high visibility work, not just the things people would see. Everything. The small details no one would notice. The behind-the-scenes preparation no one would know about. The foundational work that others skip because it isn't glamorous. You gave equal attention to what was visible and what was invisible because your standard wasn't about appearance, it was about reality. You refused to make excuses. When challenges arose, you found solutions. When obstacles appeared, you navigated them. When circumstances were difficult, you adapted. You didn't spend energy explaining why something couldn't be done. You spent energy figuring out how it could be done. Your results spoke louder than anyone else's explanations. You invested in mastery when others were content with competence. You kept learning when others decided they knew enough. You kept improving when others plateaued. You treated your craft with deep respect. Your profession as a meaningful pursuit. Your work as something that deserved care, and that respect showed in everything you produced. As a result, your baseline became everyone else's peak. Your average became their exceptional. Your consistency became so reliable, it felt ordinary to you even as it remained impressive to others. Your level didn't just affect how people talked about you. It influenced how they approached their own work. Because when the standard rises, everyone either adapts or falls behind. You encouraged growth across your entire field simply by refusing to accept the previous normal as acceptable. People started asking themselves questions they hadn't asked before. If they can do it at that level, why can't I? What would it take for me to reach that level? What habits do I need to change? Your example made average effort uncomfortable, made cutting corners feel noticeable, made half efforts appear insufficient. Some people reacted negatively. They didn't like that you made their previous best look inadequate. They didn't like that expectations rose for everyone, but their reaction didn't change reality. You had redefined what professional looked like, and there was no returning to the old standard. Others were inspired, challenged, motivated. They saw what you achieved and realized it was possible. They observed your consistency and understood it was attainable. They studied your approach and recognized it was learnable. Before you, professional meant meeting basic expectations, showing up on time, following guidelines, doing what was required. But your approach transformed the meaning. Professional became about excellence as a baseline, about quality as a consistent choice, about standards that exceed expectations. Because meeting expectations was never your goal. Professional became about how you handle the unseen parts of your work, the preparation no one witnesses, the practice no one observes, the refinement no one knows about. It became about what you do when no one is watching, because your standard is for you, not for an audience. You maintain it in private so it shows in public. Professional became about integrity in every interaction, not just with influential people or in important moments, with everyone, in every moment. Treating every conversation with respect, every commitment with seriousness, every relationship with care. You demonstrated that professionalism isn't a role you switch on for certain occasions. It's who you are consistently. Professional became about taking responsibility without being asked, about solving problems without being told, about seeing what needs to happen and making it happen without requiring instruction or approval. You showed that real professionals don't wait for direction, they create direction. And here's the daily practice that created this reality. A practice so simple, most people overlook it. So consistent, most people can't maintain it. You start before others start. Not to show off, but because your commitment to excellence requires preparation time that can't be rushed. While others are still getting ready, you're already working. While others are planning to begin, you've already begun. Your early start isn't about competing with others. It's about giving yourself the time quality requires. You finish after others finish. Not because you're slow, because you don't cut corners at the end. Don't skip the final touches. Don't settle for almost done. You see, work through to true completion. Polish what others leave rough. Refine what others leave good enough. You double check what others don't check once. Review what others never review. Your attention to accuracy isn't worry, it's professionalism. You invest in your tools, your knowledge, your skills, not occasionally, continuously. You read what others mean to read, practice what others mean to practice, learn what others mean to learn. Your growth isn't something you're planning for tomorrow. It's what you're doing today, every day, without exception. Being the standard can feel isolating, because you're no longer operating at the same level as most of your peers. You're in a space that few occupy, working at an intensity few maintain, holding standards few match. And that creates distance, not intentional, but natural. And here's what this experience actually is. It's not rejection. It's the necessary space for mastery, the separation required for deep work, the distance needed to hear your own voice above the noise of collective average thinking. You can't relate to the complaints about how hard it is to maintain basic quality. You can't join conversations about cutting corners to save time. You can't participate in the collective agreement to lower standards when things get difficult, because those aren't your experiences. Those aren't your choices. So you work alone more often, because you need space to maintain your focus. Need an environment that supports your standards. Once you became the reference point, others tried to imitate you, copied your approach, mimicked your style, attempted to reproduce your results, and some got close to the surface, looked similar to you, sounded similar to you, but couldn't match the substance, couldn't replicate the depth, couldn't maintain the consistency. Here's why imitation always falls short. They saw the output, but not the input. The results, but not the process. The achievement, but not the discipline. They wanted your level without your habits, your recognition without your commitment, your status without your substance. You can copy someone's methods. You can't copy their character. And character is what makes the standard sustainable. So those attempts faded. People grew tired of maintaining an appearance that wasn't grounded in reality, returned to their natural level. And you remained consistent, authentic, unchanged by efforts to reach you. Because your standard isn't a performance you put on, it's a reality you live. Being the standard comes with responsibility, not just to maintain your own excellence, but to understand that your choices now influence more than just your outcomes, that your example shapes others. You're responsible for continuing to grow, because if you stop evolving, you become the ceiling. You limit what's considered possible. But if you keep expanding, keep redefining excellence, you continue encouraging progress in others. You're responsible for maintaining integrity even when it costs you, because people are observing, using you as their reference point. If you compromise, you teach them that compromise is acceptable. If you cut corners, you show them corners can be cut. Your choices ripple outward beyond your own work, into the work of others. You're responsible for being gracious about your position, not arrogant, not superior, not dismissive of those still climbing toward your level. You remember being where they are. Remember the work it took to get where you are, and you honor their journey while maintaining your standard. You're the example they're reaching for, not the barrier preventing their progress. Why did your name become the benchmark and not someone else's? You were consistent when others were sporadic. They had moments of brilliance surrounded by periods of average. You had sustained excellence, day after day, week after week, year after year. Consistency isn't exciting, but it's what builds lasting recognition. It's what makes people trust that your quality isn't accidental. It's intentional, reliable, steady. You were authentic when others were performing. They tried to be what they thought professional should look like. You simply were professional in your own way. You didn't imitate anyone's version of excellence. You created your own, and authenticity resonates deeper than performance. People feel the difference between someone being themselves excellently and someone trying to appear excellent. You were humble about your ability while confident in your standards. You didn't announce being the best. You maintained standards that demonstrated it. You didn't need to declare your excellence. Your work showed it. Your results reflected it. Your consistency confirmed it. And that humility made your confidence clear rather than excessive. You cared more about the work than the recognition, more about the quality than the credit, more about substance than status. And that authentic focus on substance over appearance is what made your excellence real rather than performed, what made your impact steady rather than temporary. Your position isn't temporary. It isn't a title that expires. It's a reality you've created through years of consistency, a reputation built through countless choices, a record you're establishing through steady commitment. Once you become the standard, you remain the standard until someone exceeds you. And exceeding you requires matching your consistency, your quality, your integrity over time. And that isn't easy. That isn't common. That's why you remain the reference point. Even when you step away from active work, your name will remain what people point to. People will say, "Remember when your name set that level?" Remember what professional meant when they defined it. Your impact outlasts your direct involvement. Your influence extends beyond your day-to-day participation. Your example becomes part of the culture, part of shared memory. So here's the truth. Disciplined individual. Your name became the standard for explaining what professional looks like. Not because you sought this position, but because you earned it through consistent commitment to excellence, through steady demonstration of quality, through maintaining standards that many admire but few sustain. You're no longer measuring yourself against others. You're refining yourself against your own previous best, because being the standard isn't a destination. It's a commitment to continuous improvement. Others are reaching for the level you maintain, using your name as a reference for what they're trying to become. And that's not ego, that's outcome. That's the natural result of sustained excellence.